Hi, my name is Anna, and today I'm going to show you everything that you need to get started oil painting solvent-free. I will also go over some really basic color theory and stuff that has to do specifically with paint, and I will also show you how to clean your brushes with and without solvent, and how to tone your canvas with and without solvent, and how to prime your canvases should you choose to do that, and how to clean your palette. If any of this sounds interesting to you, please stick around. Without further ado, let's get started. First, paper towels. I recommend getting the sturdiest you can find. I like these blue shop towels. I also use the cheap ones though. Next up, get some soap. I recommend both a bar of soap and liquid soap. Dawn is excellent, and Ivory soap is also excellent. Then you'll need a jar with a sealing lid and some walnut oil or linseed oil. This is actually what we'll be using to clean our brushes while painting. If you can't afford a silly coil jar with a spring in it, improvise some wire mesh or a different spring for your jar. Next up, you'll need a palette knife for mixing paint. I like my palette knives to be stiffish but still have enough spring to them that they're easy to control. This one is too stiff. This one is too flexible. And this one from Artist's Loft, which I get at Michael's, is just right. Next up, you'll need a palette. They come in wood and glass, or you can get a pad of disposable palette paper. I will tell you a little later in the video how to make a palette out of a picture frame, like this one that I'm showing you here. Next, of course, you'll need some paintbrushes. I have some that cost me $1 and others that cost me $10 to $20. I actually really like some of my really cheap ones though, because their frayed texture and rough edges make them really great for doing fur and hair and grass. My favorite are these Artist's Loft Forensi brushes that I get at Michael's. They are on the pricier side and they're actually for acrylics, but I find they work great for oils as well. You can do wonderful paintings with cheap brushes, just so you know. Then of course you'll need something to paint on. I like flat canvas panels more than I like canvases. You can also get these paper pads for oil and acrylic, especially good for when you're practicing. I like these for doing swatches and color wheels, and I actually really don't mind the texture. Then of course you're going to need some paint. I recommend going with Gamblin's 1980 line. It is a student grade line of paint, but it is extremely high quality with a high pigment load. Lots of professional artists use it in their work. It's also very affordable compared to most paint. I recommend getting a split primary palette. This means getting a warm and cool of red, yellow, and blue. This will give you a broader range of colors that you can mix than if you only had a single of each primary color. I also recommend going with a magenta color for red if you want to mix purples, and burnt umber if you want to mix black. If you don't want to mix those, go ahead and just buy a tube of black and a tube of violet or purple. Coming up, I will explain in a little bit more detail why I recommend a split primary palette and why I recommend the magenta and the burnt umber. First things first, I just want to say that these colors that I have used to give you this example of a split primary palette are not necessarily the best colors to choose for your palette. And I just picked a few that I thought would be appropriate for this. Again, a warm and cool of each red, yellow, and blue. For my reds, I used Naphthol Red for my warm, Alizarin Crimson Permanent for my cool, and for my blues, I used Ultramarine Blue for my warm, Turquoise for my cool, and for my yellows, I used Cadmium Yellow for my warm and Hansa Yellow Light for my cool. You will also need white, that is mandatory. I am also using Burnt Umber and Quinacridone Magenta. The benefit of having 6 colors instead of just 3 is that you get a lot more secondary color options. And as you can see with these color wheels that I have made with these 6 colors, there's a lot of variety in the greens, purples, and oranges that you can get. And keep in mind, these are 50-50 mixtures of the colors. So the wide range that you could get of these secondary colors is actually a lot broader, because mixing different amounts of paint is going to yield different results. And that doesn't even touch on your tertiary colors and mixing their colors with the complements, which can neutralize your colors if they're too bright. The possibilities are endless. I also added these 2 extra color wheels on the side, where I used quinacridone magenta instead of the naphthol red or the alizarin crimson permanent. As you can see, this has kind of neutralized the orange more, and it's brightened the purple up and given it a better chroma than the other purples, which look quite black or muted. You have been lied to your whole life. When it comes to mixing paint, red is not the primary color you want if you want purple. It's magenta. You want magenta. However, if you really love purple/violet and you are going to be painting a lot of violet things, then it might actually be a good idea at some point to invest in a purple/violet tube of paint, because getting a really high chroma violet or purple is just a little bit difficult. And if you want it to really pop, maybe get a tube of purple. However, for general use, these 4 purples in the main color wheels, there's nothing wrong with them. In fact, super high chroma colors, if you're painting portraits or landscapes, are gonna look a little bit weird in that context. So something to keep in mind. Now, you can mix a perfectly adequate black, a chromatic black, with almost any combination of red, yellow, and blue. However, when I want a really neutral black and I don't want to use black straight from the tube, I really prefer to use burnt umber and ultramarine blue. As you can see, they make a really, really nice neutral black. This one here is a combination of alizarin crimson permanent, ultramarine blue, and cadmium yellow. And it's a good black, especially because you tend to want a little bit of color in your blacks, depending on the context of your painting. Not always. There's nothing wrong with using black from the tube, despite what many people have probably told you. It just depends on what you're painting. In general, though, I tend to like to be aware of mixing a little bit of color into my black or mixing it from other colors, just because that's going to give it a little bit more life. This color is a little bit purple, and in the right context, that's fantastic. Nothing wrong with that. So keep in mind, chromatic blacks are better than straight black from the tube, but not always. Sometimes straight black from the tube is great. I like black, okay? There are honestly an endless amount of combinations when it comes to color palettes, and all of them can be useful for lots of things. I have heard multiple artists say now that using raw sienna, yellow ochre, cerulean blue, white, and alizarin crimson permanent are the only colors you need to mix any color. I haven't tried that palette yet, but I'm super interested in trying it. And that's my super fast, pretty basic, scratch the surface rundown of colors. So do some research, figure out what feels right for you, especially if you know you're going to be painting landscapes or portraits or still lifes. You can do some research and figure out what might be the best colors for you. Like I probably said earlier, I would definitely recommend going with the Gamblin 1980 line of paints. They're affordable, but they're also extremely high quality with high pigment loads. And that is what you want. Under no circumstances should you get the store-bought from Walmart kits of oil paint that are super cheap and have a brand that you have never heard of. Those are going to have really low pigment loads and just bad light fastness and all kinds of stuff. So if you want affordable paint that isn't crappy paint, go with Gamblin's 1980 line. 10 out of 10 recommend. There's one exception to that rule. Gamblin's 1980 line does not make an alizarin crimson hue or an alizarin crimson permanent. If you're going to get an alizarin crimson paint, I highly recommend investing in an alizarin crimson permanent / alizarin crimson hue. The cheapest one that I found is by Gamblin's just professional line, and that one was, I think, $21. Alizarin crimson is an extremely fugitive pigment, meaning that it is going to fade very quickly in direct sunlight and over time in any conditions where there's light at all. So when looking for alizarin crimson paint, remember you want hue or permanent on the tube. If either of those words is not on the tube, then you're going to have the OG original alizarin crimson paint, which is fantastic, but it is, as I said, very fugitive. I will be using mine in sketchbooks where they'll be in the dark. If you want to know how to paint in a sketchbook with oil paint, let me know. I will do a video on that if you want one. I have used them side by side and they look exactly the same to me. There are a lot of paints that have hue on in the name on the tube, and that just means that it's an imitation of the pigment that was originally used. It is used a lot when it comes to paints that have heavy metal in them, and you know, a lot of people don't want to paint with heavy metal. I personally have no problem using cadmiums and cobalts. They are not soluble through skin, so I just make sure to wash my hands thoroughly before I touch anything that isn't my painting stuff. But that being said, if you feel nervous about that, then look for paints with hue in the name. That means that they are imitations and that they don't have heavy metals in them and should be non-toxic. All that being said, don't eat paint. That's it. Don't eat your paint. A common misconception is that oil paints are more toxic than watercolor or acrylic, and the truth is that's just not the case. Professional and student grade watercolor paints and acrylic paints use the same pigments that oil paints use. They just have a different binder. Linseed oil and walnut oil that are typically used as the binder for oil paint are not toxic either. They don't give off fumes, so painting with oil paint on its own is not dangerous. As long as, like I said earlier, you don't eat your paint. But also don't eat your watercolor paint or your acrylic paint. Those are also not good. It's the same stuff with a different binder. Don't eat your paint. You get some tape and you stick it to the back of your paper or your canvas and you stick it to a wall or a desk. Or you stack some books up, lay some tape on the table to keep another book from falling down, and you stick it to that. Improvise. You got this. You don't need mediums. In fact, it's advised that while you're just starting out painting, you don't use them so that you get to know your paint better. Later on, you can dive into the complex and wonderful world of mediums, but don't worry about it when you're first getting started. If you want to learn about mediums and start using them despite what I'm saying, there are a million videos on YouTube that talk about mediums and the fat over lean method of oil painting. I use gray on my canvas when I am either painting color wheels or doing color testing. Also, having a neutral gray background on your palette can be really helpful too. Having a neutral gray background on your palette or your canvas can help you see your colors more clearly. Having your colors on a stark white background makes them look too bright. Here, I'm just painting over some pencil lines that I had on a canvas that I was going to use for a color wheel. This was in preparation for doing the color wheels that I did for this video. I used a fixative on the pencil, so I couldn't erase it. In order to do this, I used my white gesso, and I used some super cheap, like $2 Applegate acrylic paint to mix a neutral gray. When I made my picture frame palette that I showed you earlier, and I'll show you here again, I took a piece of oil paper, like acrylic oil painting paper from a pad for that, and I painted the whole thing neutral gray, and I put that inside of the frame, which just makes a super simple neutral gray background so that I can mix my colors more accurately. To make a picture frame palette, just go to the thrift store or order one online or wherever you can find a super cheap picture frame. Even one you might have up in your attic or in your storage room will probably work just fine. Mine has kind of frosted glass, which I don't recommend. Try to find one with really smooth glass and get a piece of oil painting paper and paint it neutral gray. Tape the background closed, and lo and behold, you've got yourself a really simple palette. You've probably seen artists toning their canvases, such as I am doing here with burnt sienna or other neutral tones, or even hot pink sometimes, and other things. And you might be wondering why. It accomplishes two things. It puts a mid-tone on your canvas so that your colors look more accurate as you lay them down, and it covers up all that super scary, intimidating white. You can use any color you want, and it might be something you would like to experiment with. I personally like to use burnt sienna usually, but honestly I'd like to try hot pink sometime and some other colors that I've seen artists use. Burnt sienna makes a really nice warm neutral, and it kind of gives the painting a glow, which I really like. I've also used yellow ochre in the past, so you can just see what you like and what works for you. How do you do this, you might ask? Well, you can do it two ways that I have tried. There might be other ways, so don't just take my word for it. Here I am using thinned down burnt sienna paint, and I am thinning it with a solvent. I'm using Gamsol here. If you don't want to use solvents, you can use the other method where you use acrylic. Take some acrylic paint, thin it down with water, and spread it over your canvas. I recommend thinning it more than I did here. I had to do my drawing again. I couldn't see it anymore. You do not need solvent to paint. If you want really thin underlayers, then you might consider using it just for that, but you don't need it. And as for cleaning your brushes, which a lot of people use their solvent for, you don't need to do that either. I'm going to show you how to clean your brushes with walnut oil or linseed oil and plain soap and water. If you do decide to use solvents, even in a minimal approach like I do, keep your lid on your jar when you're not using it so that you're not breathing in the fumes, and get yourself some gloves. Whenever you have the chance of getting solvent on your hands, please be wearing gloves. I use walnut oil to keep my brushes clean while I am painting, and I'm going to show you how I do that. I'm using alizarin crimson here because it's very pigmented and it's a little bit stubborn, I've noticed. So I thought it'd be good for this example. I just use my walnut oil in my silly coil jar and a paper towel. To clean paint off your brush, you can wipe it on a paper towel first to get the excess off, and then dip it in your oil and start moving the bristles over your coil or your wire mesh or whatever you have in there, or just the edge of the jar if you don't have mesh or anything. Try to keep it out of the bottom just because that's where a lot of your pigment is going to settle and you might just make it more yucky. Then wipe your brush on the edge of your jar to make sure you've got most of your pigment out. You can see it dripping down the side, and then wipe it off on your paper towel. And repeat this as many times as necessary. After you've gotten your brushes as clean as possible with your oil, take your brushes into the bathroom with a fresh paper towel and get yourself your soap. There are special soaps for oil paint and brushes out there. If you can afford those, go for it, but a bar of Ivory soap and or a bottle of Dawn dish soap works perfectly well. I am using a bar here that's specifically for oil paint, but you don't need it. I dip my brush in a solution of water and Dawn only long enough to wet the brush. I don't want pigment getting into this water, as I want to avoid washing pigment down the drain as much as possible. I then run my brush over my bar soap at an angle. You will literally see the paint coming off onto the soap. I never rinse this bar in the sink, I just let it dry on its little soap dish. After running it over the soap, I wipe it off on a paper towel and repeat this until the brush is clean. Once it's clean, I swish it in the Dawn solution more thoroughly to condition the bristles. I shape them and I lay the brush flat to dry. Don't dry your brushes upright, as water can seep into the ferrule and damage the glue. And that's it. Simple as that. To get your brushes clean without using any solvent. If you do use solvent to clean your brushes, you still need to wash them with soap and water so that you don't have your solvent or your oil drying on your brushes. To clean wet paint off your palette, take a palette knife and scrape the excess paint off of your palette, and you can either put it in a container and put it in the freezer to save it for later, or if you're just completely done with it, you can wipe it on a paper towel if there isn't very much of it, or you can take a plastic container like I have here. I was taught this by Ryan Pancoast, by the way, and scrape your excess paint off and put it in this little container. This can eventually either be thrown away once the paint is dry or taken to a facility where they dispose of paint and stuff like that. Again, like I said earlier in the video, just check what is allowed in your area, what is necessary according to the law where you live. A lot of people who have set colors for their palette that they paint with all the time just leave piles of paint on their palette. I am far too neat of a person to be comfortable doing this. I don't like it. If you are cool with that though, go ahead and give it a go. Personally, I like to get my palettes completely clean between paintings and sometimes between painting sessions. Once you've gotten the excess paint off of your palette with a palette knife, go ahead and take a paper towel or a rag and wipe as much of the paint that's remaining off of your palette. There will still be an oily residue, so after this I take some liquid soap and water and I either wipe it off with a paper towel, or if I have some stubborn paint, I scrub it with an old toothbrush and then wipe it off with a paper towel. And that will leave me with a completely clean palette. If your palette has paint dried onto it, the first steps are the same. Take your wet paint and either remove it and put it in a container that is sealable to put in the freezer to use for later, or put it in your plastic disposal container. Scrape all of the dried paint off that you can and get that into your plastic disposal container using a palette knife. Once you've done everything you can with a palette knife, get a razor blade scraper, such as I have here, and scrape off the dried paint. This only works on a glass palette. If you have a wooden palette, I recommend never letting your paint dry onto it unless you're gonna hang it on the wall and never use it again. Getting dried paint off of a wooden palette is going to be extremely difficult without ruining the palette. I'll take this opportunity to tell you that yes, you can save your paint in the freezer in an airtight container. I like to put my paint in just a Tupperware container. I scrape it off onto the lid. That just makes it easier to get it on and off and in and out of the container. If you don't want to put it in the freezer, you can put a little drop of, or or 3 drops of clove oil on a little bit of paper towel or a cotton ball inside of a sealed container to save your paint. Clove oil also slows oxidation. I do have some colors that still dry out in the freezer. That's just the nature of some pigments, and I live in an extremely dry region, so my paint tends to dry faster than it might for you, depending on where you live. After I scrape off the dried paint and also keep my scraper clean with paper towels, I then go in with soap and water, and this is where I absolutely use my toothbrush to scrub off the stubborn paint to get my palette completely clean. And then I wipe it dry with a dry paper towel. I unfortunately don't have footage of me using the toothbrush, but I have faith that you can figure that out. This last thing that I'm going to share with you is absolutely not necessary. You can paint on your store-bought canvases right out of the package just fine with no problem. I do recommend looking for canvases that say that they are archival on the packaging, unless you're just using them for practice. That way you'll know that your painting is going to last. Use what you can afford. Get the best that you can afford. Don't stress about it. I'm using pretty mid-tier canvases here. They aren't expensive, but they're not the cheapest available. They have quite a lot of texture on them, and the reason I'm doing this is I really don't like a lot of texture on my canvases. So I take gesso, you can use clear gesso or white gesso, it doesn't really matter, and I pour it onto my canvas, and I use I think it's a bread cutter, it's just plastic, and I use that to do the initial spreading. I have to work really fast because I live in a very dry climate, and after I have spread with the bread cutter, I use a brush to even things out and get it into the places that it's hard to get it with the bread cutter. And at the very end, I go over it both directions, the entire length of the canvas, just to smooth everything out and get an even texture. I leave this to dry for 24 hours at least, and then I lightly sand it with a very fine grit sandpaper. I then wipe it off with a paper towel and some water to get all the dust off, and then I repeat as necessary. To get the canvases smooth enough for my taste, it usually takes 2 to 4 coats depending on the canvas brand. When oil painting solvent free, whether it's with regular oil paint or with water-soluble oil paint, it is important to remember that there is one thing that is quite dangerous. Just one thing. Linseed oil and walnut oil dry through oxidation, not evaporation. This means that while they're oxidizing, drying, they give off heat. So when you're done with your oil painting paper towels or rags or what have you, it is a good idea to lay them flat to dry for a few days or to hang them up in a ventilated area. Do not bunch them up. Do not crush them into the trash can until they're dry to the touch. If those oils are trapped while they're giving off heat through oxidation, there's a small possibility that they could combust spontaneously and start a fire. This is extremely unlikely with oil paint on its own, and it's never going to happen when it's on your canvas. That's just never going to happen. That's a myth. However, if you're using linseed oil or walnut oil to clean your brushes and you have a paper towel or a rag that is super saturated with oil, that is a bigger problem. You need to leave that to dry for a while before you throw it away. Granted, you also need to check what the laws are in your area, in your city, your country, your state, whatever it is, about disposing of paint and oils and stuff like that. So in some places, once paint and stuff is completely dry, once oil is completely dry, you can put it in the trash can and throw it away. However, in other places, you need to take those things to a special dumping site or processing place what have you. Just look into what is required for your area. My studio is in a basement where I'm by myself, so I hang mine on little clotheslines that I made over the bathtub. Super simple. All right, everybody, that's it for today. If you have any questions or comments or even tips on how I can improve how I go about things, please let me know. I'm still learning, so anything you have to share would be super, super helpful, and I'd be very grateful. I hope that you learned something and that this video was helpful to you in some way. If it was, or if you just enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you. Bye!